What are some terrifying declassified government documents? Story 1, Project 100,000. In the early years of Vietnam, Robert McNamara created Project 100,000 as a way to draft those who previously failed to meet military mental and medical standards. This included a lot of Americans with an IQ below 70. The majority of these men didn't have above a ninth grade education and were, in a sense, a lot like Forrest Gump and Gomer Pyle. Because of obvious learning disabilities and difficulty understanding, these morons were mostly given jobs on the front lines of the war. It was worded as a service project, and they were told it would help them gain skills needed to live a better life after the service. In reality, they were cannon fodder for the DoD and died at a much higher rate than their non-disabled counterparts. These men largely couldn't read, write, or understand why they were in Vietnam or what they were there to do. They suffered more cases of PTSD, lower unemployment rates, and higher rates of divorce and self-deletion than non-NSM veterans. Very sad story of the government taking advantage of its own citizens. Story 2. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests, and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her, and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Story 3. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all, of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. Story 4. Project Pluto, a plan to make a nuclear-powered cruise missile that would fly around low to the ground, spewing radiation and leaving massive sonic boom, carrying a payload of multiple nuclear bombs to drop on key targets. After dropping those, it would continue to fly around the countryside for weeks. Cancelled in the 60s. But the idea has recently been receiving new attention from both the Russians and Americans, if I recall correctly. Story 5. The Pentagon documents during the Vietnam War. I'd say they're more disgusting than terrifying, but a document leaked saying the war was unwinnable and the US was still present only to prevent a humiliating defeat. If I remember correctly, the document leaked in 1969, and combat troops were in Vietnam until 1973, followed by South Vietnam's collapse in 1975. It's mostly terrifying because over 60,000 Americans were killed and an estimated 1 million Vietnamese. While halfway through, the feds realized it was a lost cause, but didn't stop. Story 6. Cointel Pro was a series of covert and, at times, illegal projects conducted by the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations. FBI records show that Cointel Pro resources targeted groups and individuals that the FBI deemed subversive, including feminist organizations, the Communist Party USA, anti-Vietnam War organizers, activists of the Civil Rights Movement or Black Power movement, example given Martin Luther King Jr., the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party, environmentalist and animal rights organizations, the American Indian Movement, independence movements such as Puerto Rican independence groups like the Young Lords, and a variety of organizations that were part of the broader New Left. Story 7. The 25-year declassification release of some of the JFK assassination files a few years ago. They were released by the FBI and acknowledged 2 shooters. So the FBI knew, the government knew, 2 shooters. Why did they lie to the people? And why spend decade after decade convincing people who realized the physics meant there must be 2 shooters that they were nuts? I've heard one theory that explains the JFK assassination. There was one assassin. After the first shot was fired that killed the president with a shot to the head, a Secret Service agent jumped up into the president's vehicle as it sped off. Fumbling for his weapon, the pistol went off accidentally, hitting the president a second time. It would be understandable that the government would want to keep this hidden, as it would be extremely embarrassing to announce that a Secret Service agent wound up shooting the president, even if it was after JFK was already dead. Story 8. How about the Davy Crockett atomic rifle? Basically, a football-sized nuke hooked to an RPG-style launcher. It couldn't actually propel the nuke far enough that the soldier would be outside the blast, so the plan was for the soldiers to dig a foxhole, fire the nuke, then drop into the foxhole and weather the blast that way. Yes, really. Hi there, Private. Launch this nuke, and then let the blast wave and huge radiation pulse wash over you while you lay flat in a tiny little ditch. Duck and cover. The intent was that it'd be a great weapon against Soviet tanks trying to travel through Germany, and as a special bonus, it'd make the land a radiated hellscape to deny it to any Soviets. Unlike Project Pluto, which was even more terrifying but never got out of the planning stages, the US military actually built and deployed Davy Crockett to soldiers. Story 9. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment proves the US government will do just about anything to people, even to its own citizens. 15 file cabinet drawers were filled with paperwork detailing the FBI spying operation on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., detailing just how far the FBI is willing to go to discredit a single man simply because the director doesn't like his politics. Similar, yet more refined, harassment has been used on others since then, usually resulting in people losing their jobs, homes, family, friends, and sometimes even requiring they flee the country in order to escape FBI harassment. The Abu Ghraib images are all of men, and roughly half the pictures were never released to the public because they were too inflammatory. Now, what could be more inflammatory than what was already released? It's quite simple to figure out. Fully half the Abu Ghraib prison population were women and children, yet not a single image of women or children being tortured were released. Story 10. The Katyn Forest Massacre. After the joint invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR, the Russians executed 22,000 Polish officers and buried their remains in mass graves in the Katyn Forest. Years later, some of the bodies were discovered. The Soviets decided to cover up the atrocity by claiming it was the Germans that did it, based on a German pistol being found in the area. Many people had their doubts, but this was the Soviet Union. You couldn't just openly question the state. Just before the collapse, the truth was finally revealed. Story 11. Most shocking. Heard it a few weeks ago. Before the Romanian Revolution in '89, the secret police, Securitatea, was trained for years to encounter a massive Soviet invasion, like what happened in Czechoslovakia, by using guerrilla tactics, disinformation, and terror among the occupying forces. When the revolution broke out, it was thought that the country was infiltrated by the enemy in disguise. But the document said there was no intervention of Magyar or Russian spies among protesters along all the protests. The army had been brought in, but when Ceausescu asked it to open fire, the army refused. That's when the secret police, dressed in army clothes, started to open fire. Ceausescu had no intention to flee the country with his helicopter. He was preparing for a full-scale invasion, thinking Western or foreign forces are attacking the country. There is also a myth about Ion Iliescu that he would have been actually chosen by foreign forces, USSR and USA, to rule the country after Ceausescu's death, making the revolution into a coup. Also, I realized that the terrorist panic was actually produced by the secret police that was implementing its strategy of guerrilla war and terror, being loyal to the communists at the very end. It is shocking because it explains why over 1,000 people died during the revolution. Yet, most of them happened in strange, short encounters with people dressed in black and using weapons the Romanian military did not have. Securitatea also had the latest technologies in equipment and arms. also realized the secret police had a secret magazine in which they could publish things they were interested in, like the latest methods to break a man with torture, or the already mentioned plan in case the country was occupied by a force the army couldn't handle. Story 12. There is proof of people being able to seamlessly see their surroundings with their eyes closed by just being given coordinates. I did some reading on how the CIA were experimenting with a number of people who claimed they could do this. They gave one guy the coordinates of the backside of the moon, and one guy the coordinates on Mars. They were both able to completely explain their surroundings without ever being told that it wasn't on Earth. These documents are 100% public. There is also documentation on monks and such being able to levitate off the ground. On these reports, though it seems like 99% of them would not do it around cameras or a crowd, and it could take hours of meditation and focus to just float 1 inch. Another document was on manifestation. That document gets pretty crazy, and I won't try going into explaining it. If you know what it is, you know what it is. There are over thousands of aeronautical reports of aliens, like aircrafts flying around reported by commercial pilots and military pilots over the past century. All of them who report it are told the same thing. Yeah, right, buddy. Go get some sleep. Except, of course, for the few that are leaked by cameras. But the only aircrafts with even remotely good cameras are all military, which, of course, classify all recordings. Story 13. This is a British file. At the height of the war with the IRA, the Northern Irish Minister of Intelligence tried to advise the rest of the government that there may be nuclear missiles inside a mountain. What makes this really terrifying is that the English government at the time refused to confirm or deny this, meaning that there could be up to 20 nuclear missiles in a mountain in Northern Ireland. Story 14. There's a huge collection of documents from the Project Blue Book, which was a military investigation into UFOs from the 50s and 60s. There are witness reports, photographs, and even a couple of film reels. Most of the military responses are hot air balloon, film grain, light bleeding into the photo, and some are unidentified. Story 15. On January 3, 1961, a United States B-52 bomber went into a tailspin and broke up mid-air, accidentally dropping 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs over Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the bombs worked exactly as intended. Its parachute deployed and its triggers activated, armed and ready to detonate on impact. 3 of the 4 safety switches failed. A single low-voltage switch prevented 2 4-megaton nuclear explosions. Story 16. I remember reading something about a conspiracy nut who filed to receive all the info, Freedom of Information Act, the CIA had on mind control and putting thoughts into people's heads. A lot of people laughed at him, then promptly shat their pants when the guy received about 20 plus pages on all of the experiments the CIA had done on the subject. Apparently, using microwaves, scientists were able to make subjects hear single-syllable words in their heads. What's crazy is that if they could do this, then imagine all the shit that was either shredded or is too classified to release. Story 16. John F. Kennedy's brain was lost before it could be autopsied. I'm gonna say that again. Assassinated President John F. Kennedy's brain was lost. I don't mean what was left at the scene. I mean they cut it out of his head, set it aside, and went, whoops. On the other hand, no one at the time was expecting an assassination. There was no plan set up for who would do what if a president was killed. I heard a coroner give a talk about how anyone who gets an autopsy today gets a better one than Kennedy. But it does really creep me out that someone probably kept the brain for a trophy. Story 18. 2 events that happened before I was born and 2 heroes. Stanislav Petrov in 1983 refused to report a possible nuclear launch of 5 missiles. Thinking that an American attack would be all out rather than just 5, he didn't report it to his superiors, who he worried, being military personnel, might launch a counterattack immediately. It turned out not to be an attack. but a technical error with the satellite. The second guy, who definitely stopped World War III, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, was flotilla commander of the Russian submarine flotilla involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 27, 1962, a Russian sub was found by an American battle group. The Americans dropped signaling depth charges to force the sub to surface for identification. As the sub had been hiding in deep water, it had no way of knowing if the USSR and the US were at war. The captain of the sub wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo, but Arkhipov, who was serving as first officer on the sub as well as flotilla commander, refused. This action basically prevented a nuclear shooting war and probably World War III. Funnily enough, Arkhipov also served on the infamous K-19, and it was that reputation which managed to convince the sub-captain to not launch the nuclear torpedoes. I remember reading these two events and realizing how fragile our way of life is. The fate of the world left to one man and one decision, maybe not as shocking as other classified info, but definitely humbling. Story 19. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they describe it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about until recently. Story 20. Personally, I think it's Echelon. In case you don't know, it was a signal intercept program that began in the 1960s. Basically, NATO, Australia, and New Zealand all agreed to spy on each other and share the information. That way, they wouldn't be violating any domestic laws about spying on citizens. This was all widely disclosed between 1988 and 2001, but people act like Snowden was the first time we found out the government was listening. No one was ostracized or called crazy for saying this. The truth is that hardly anyone cared at the time. Then 9/11 happened, and even less people cared about what the government did. Story 21. My favorite has to be the U.S. military's first broken arrow event. The evening of Valentine's Day, 1951, USAF Bomber 075, a B-36 Peacemaker bomber carrying a Mark IV Fat Man nuclear weapon, suddenly loses power to 3 of its 6 turboprop engines while on a training mission following the British Columbia coastline. With no other options, the crew drops the bomb into the Pacific and sets its autopilot to fly out into the Pacific while the crew bailed out. All hands except for the plane's weaponeer, Captain Ted Schreier. Instead of flying out into the Pacific and crashing, the crippled bomber made a complete U-turn and flew inland, heading north towards Alaska, eventually landing on a mountaintop in the Kispiox Ranges, near Terrace, British Columbia. When the plane was discovered in 1953, the USAF took over the airfield at Smithers, British Columbia, and helicoptered into the crash site, gathering important technologies before blowing the plane to bits. It's believed by some that the Fat Man bomb on board 075 was in fact armed, and the weaponeer tried to fly the bomber home. When the bomb was discovered at the crash site, the Air Force detonated the bomb, as they had no means of safely removing it from the mountain. Story 22. The use of Chernobyl biorobots. In order to seal and cap the reactor with a sarcophagus, they needed to clear rubble from the nearby roof, a large portion of which was literally material from the core itself. At first, they used remote-piloted robots, but they died pretty damn fast due to the radiation being too much for their electronics. So instead, they used biorobots, or as they are more commonly known, human beings. Groups of soldiers would dress in hastily made lead suits. They had to make them themselves, and for 45-second intervals, they would shovel rubble from the roof back into the exposed core of the reactor. After only this short time, the robots would experience deep bone pain, blurred sight, and a lot of other scary fudging symptoms that are best not thought about. They did multiple runs just like this, rotating groups shoveling the inside of a nuclear reactor. They were rewarded with bottles of Pepsi and Coke. Story 23. That the U.S. government secretly performed radiation experiments on hundreds of citizens used as human guinea pigs over 30 years from the 40s through the 70s, with the knowledge of thousands of officials and medical personnel, and kept secret until the 90s. The story was finally broken by reporter Eileen Wellsome, who won the Pulitzer for her reporting and led to congressional hearings. I had first heard a few stories in the 90s, but did not truly know the full extent until I read her book, The Plutonium Files. Story 24. Operation Choke Point. Operation Choke Point is an initiative of the U.S. Department of Justice that was announced in 2013, which is investigating banks in the U.S. and the business they do with payment processors, payday lenders, and other companies believed to be at higher risk for fraud and money laundering. In other words, the government would tell banks not to loan people money to people involved with certain industries. Now, that might not sound too bad until you read the list of things being investigated, which includes anyone selling firearms or ammunition, fireworks stores, lotteries, and tobacco stores. Of course, now they just say that banks shouldn't loan to those people, instead of outright telling them not to. Story 25. I believe my generation may have been the last to have received the smallpox vaccine, and the assumption that the disease has been eradicated. However, there are military stockpiles of weapons-grade smallpox. If the disease were reintroduced into the population, people of my generation may still have immunity, but younger generations could still be vulnerable. Deaths from the spread of smallpox could affect countless millions of people. Story 26. One I'm surprised no one mentioned. U.S. military running a massive social media campaign in the Middle East to start major revolutions. Basically, U.S. troops were using special software to run hundreds of Facebook pages to make it look like there was a lot more support for government overthrow than there actually was. I read about it on the WikiLeaks in 2010, didn't really believe it, and then we all know what happened in 2011. Story 27. Snowden revealed documents that showed that the government has unprecedented ability to access air-gapped computers. One such ability is installing a cable between the computer and monitor and shooting X-rays through the room to collect information from the illicit cable. Think about that. Story 28. The Nixon White House tapes. It's terrifying that a man that emotionally volatile, hateful, and paranoid had his finger on the button during some of the tensest years in history. I'm actually shocked he never nuked Russia because their ambassador failed to compliment his tie.